this Transition Talks conversation. Today, we are asking the question, are transition plans becoming a license for companies to operate? A short housekeeping remark before we dive into our subject. For our guests joining online, we invite you to share your views and ask your questions in the comments box. We'll try our best to respond in writing. Now, let's get started by setting the scene. The EU Chemicals Industry Transition Pathway was released by the European Commission earlier this year. This document offers an actionable roadmap aiming to guide the chemical industry to 2050, achieving the EU Green Deal goals while remaining competitive and resilient. Cefic has been highly committed to the exercise. We hope it places our industry ahead of the curve and will open the path for our member companies to work further on their own transition plans. We see the notion of transition plans appearing in multilateral, national and market guidelines and across several EU pieces of legislation. So today, we are going to dive into the status of transition plans and will examine if or even how long until they become a license for a company to operate. I am delighted to be here with Sven Gedner, Head of Unit responsible for corporate reporting at DG FISMA, European Commission, to get his perspective on the role of transition plans in order to channel investments towards the Green Deal objectives. And Alexandra Palinska, Executive Director at Eurocif, the European Sustainable Investments Forum, to hear what the investor community needs and expects from industry. Alexandra and Sven, welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
Perhaps the most useful starting point for today's discussion is to set the scene and understand Europe's regulatory landscape. So Sven, transition plans are mandated by the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, a requirement which is then fleshed out by the European Sustainability Reporting Standards and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. Beyond sustainability reporting, transition plans are increasingly becoming an obligation or an element of conditionality in EU law with the EU Industrial Emissions Directive and the EU ETS Directive. Could you please touch on these different pieces of legislation and explain how and why the Commission sees increasingly transition plans as a way to steer progress towards the Green Deal objectives?
First of all, thank you for having me. And so in terms of the overall approach that we're taking to sustainability, I think there are two different parts which are important. The one is, as you said, we define sectoral goals where we want to get. We've clearly said we want to become carbon neutral by 2050. We want to phase out internal combustion engines. We have set goals in terms of also the chemical sectors where we want to get. These are, if you want, hardwired goals that we want to achieve. And then there are different ways on how to get them. In the financial sphere, on sustainable finance, the approach that we've taken is we want more transparency on what companies do, and we also want more transparency on where companies want to go and what their plans are. And that's where the transition plans come in. So we want investors to be able to understand how is a company planning to cope with the requirements that it will be faced with in the future. How is it planning to become carbon neutral? How is it planning to implement the goals in the chemical area? How is it planning to implement the goals in other areas? And I think here transition plans are very important because, of course, at the moment, most companies do not fulfill these goals, so just as we as a society, as an economy do not fulfill these goals. But we want everyone to look at this, plan ahead, and then the investors to be able to judge, is this actually realistic? Is this company doing it properly? Is this company maybe ahead of others? Is it behind? And this, of course, will then influence investment decisions and maybe also decisions by other stakeholders like customers, like clients, and so on. So I think they do play a very important role, yes.
Thank you, Sven. So Alexandra, Sven just mentioned investors, and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive will require in-scope companies to disclose transition plans, including actions and related financial and investment plans. Could you tell us how important having a robust, comprehensive transition plan would be in the hope of attracting crucial investments needed for companies, by companies for the transition. How will it help these companies getting access to finance?
Well, thank you for having me today, and thank you for this, very pertinent question. Actually, the reason why I have, some paper actually here, because I wanted to speak a little bit about the investment gap, which, I think has been now, I would say, researched and demonstrated by various reports, including, impact assessment by the European Commission, but also many others, including a recent report by the World Economic Forum and Oliver Wyman, estimating that approximately 50 trillion of investments is required actually by 2050 to transition the global economy to net zero, basically, and avert a climate catastrophe. So basically, I think that's, kind of self-telling, right? And obviously, investors need reliable and comparable sustainability-related disclosures by the investee companies in order to make informed decisions. So this is, well, basically robust and reliable information on company transition plans, including climate targets, is basically a prerequisite in order to help investors channel investments basically for the just transition. So that's, I think, already, I would say, quite self-telling. Also, just to mention that as EuroCev, we did also publish earlier this year results of a study supported also by the survey, whereby we've been speaking to quite a lot of asset managers. And basically, we have been trying to understand their appetite for climate-related data and what data they are already quite happy with, what maybe needs further improvements, what is missing. And indeed, disclosures on the climate targets and related transition plans are still assessed as, unfortunately, relatively low quality by 50% of our respondents. So that's definitely, kind of room for improvement, and of course, an area that we hope will be improved now with the adoption and with the implementation of the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, which for the largest companies will already start applying as from basically beginning of next year. And to that end, we believe that this is, a great achievement of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards to lay down appropriate disclosures, basically, that will hopefully help investors assess the quality of the transition plans and climate targets. But yes, I mean, overall, I think in how things are going right now, and with the exacerbating, climate change and the urgency needed for action, I think also the increasing number of investors and other finance providers are basically very much interested in this data. So to that end, yes, I do believe that this is a type of actually target, and eventually then that needs to be supported by related disclosures that will soon become a prerequisite actually for companies to attract financing.
Thank you, Alexandra. Sven, with all these reporting obligations comes a greater reporting burden for companies. Yet there are also opportunities. Could you outline some of those opportunities for companies investing in their own transition plans, and tell us how the Commission will ensure that reporting is manageable for companies, especially small and medium-sized enterprises?
Yes, I mean, I think it has become clear already that it will be ever more important for companies to do this kind of reporting. Well, first, there is a legal obligation now to do it, but I think beyond that, there is also an obligation or an interest coming from the market, because investors want to know and they want to understand what companies do to prepare to be able to meet the goals that they've either set themselves or that they're set by legislation, and we've talked about that already. So I think it is very important for every company to do this kind of reporting. because in the end, it will, of course, give them access to finance. It will convince their customers of the quality, not only of their product, but also of their processes. It might also be important to retain or gain new employees, because I think it is becoming more and more important for people to understand what is the footprint of the company that I work for, what are its plans. So I think in many respects, these kinds of this kind of reporting, this kind of information will become more and more important. But of course, you're right, all of this comes with a cost, and we are aware of that. You've probably seen that within the CSRD, there are rules already in terms of how we want to phase in reporting requirements, because we are aware that it's of course more complex, more difficult for the smaller ones who are not used to this kind of reporting. We've introduced additional flexibility in the standards themselves. So we've said that certain types of companies, again, below a threshold of 750 employees, have more time, that you get more time on difficult areas like biodiversity or certain social reporting. And now we're working together with EFRAG and others to make sure that companies are also supported in this process, so that they have a place where they can turn to ask questions, that additional guidance is provided, how the reporting should be done. And then I think in the end, it will now take an effort by everyone, by the companies, by the auditors, by the supervisors, by everyone in this biosphere, in this ecosphere, if you want, to work together to make this happen and make it a success. Because it's a big change. It's a big change in terms of what we've introduced now. But I think given all these flexibilities and the phase-in that I've talked about, we can make this work, and that everyone can then step by step grow into these kinds of reporting requirements.
Thank you. So, Alexandra, we have this regulatory framework, which in a sense moves beyond pure disclosure, nudging companies to turn aspiration into real change. Transition plan stands as a tool to demonstrate the capital markets, investors, and other stakeholders, as was just mentioned, that a company is really committed. Could you please touch upon investors' expectations at this point? What are the investors looking for? What are the main hallmarks of a solid transition plan? And where do you see room for improvement? Because you say the quality of the data was not always what you were expecting. So what can be done to improve when developing such company strategy?
Thank you. And maybe just starting off with regards to, once again, the quality of the disclosures. Indeed, I mentioned that our reports pointed towards the low quality right now, but actually there has been also interesting study performed by the Net Zero Tracker recently, assessing that, well, there is good news and bad news in a way, that 50% of the world's largest publicly listed companies have now net zero targets, which of course, you know, in itself is a great news. However, they also actually mentioned that the quantity rules over quality with regards to that, and that, yes, basically, unfortunately, again, it's very often difficult for investors to compare the information, and I would say there are not sufficiently frequently science-based and or, for instance, you know, underpinned by credible climate scenarios or verified, which again are all the aspects which are quite important for investors. So maybe going into a little bit more, I would say, detail of what is really needed. I mean, it is important to have science-based targets, and to that end, I think, you know, both here the European sustainability reporting standards can already, you know, also kind of guide. And what is also very positive, that there has been really an immense amount of work done by the Commission and EFRAG in, you know, to cooperate with the ISB, and that actually here the standards are fairly aligned. So that's also great news. Then what is really also essential is that I would say here the disclosures cover both scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Of course, you know, we acknowledge that for the scope 3 emissions, I think especially for some companies, it is still challenging and, you know, work in practice. But eventually that's something really important to have. Also, ideally, it would be good that actually the targets are really showing the clear pathway towards the 1.5 scenario. Whereby actually we do also appreciate that currently it might be still a bit challenging, I would say, if there is no clarity yet on the kind of, I would say, divisions, per country, but I understand it's sort of, in the pipeline. And it's also something that may be then dependent, on the sectors, right? So we may need, clear sectoral pathways, whereby to that end, I think it's quite appreciated, your initiative together with DG Growth, to create this kind of pathway for the chemical industry. And I think something that hopefully will be also helped by the development of the sectorial European sustainability reporting standards, and considering, again, the specificities of different industries. Another element which is really crucial are the clear conditions for the offsets. And I believe that this is actually one small detail where there is a bit of a difference between ESRSs and ISB standards. However, and yeah, it's a tiny but an important one in a way. So yes, I would say here the conditions for the offset and what can qualify as the offset is quite important. Then again, here transparency is key. So even if the offsets are, for instance, included then in the target or the transition plan, that's fine as long as there is sufficient clarity on that. Obviously, investors are interested to receive basically the ongoing reporting on the implementation of the targets and transition plans, and understand where companies are on the path towards achieving them. And here for a second, I would like to maybe make a link with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is currently negotiated, and which we believe is actually essential to underpin the provisions of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, because obviously here we're talking about the disclosures, and the Article 15 in the so-called CSDDD is actually essential to require at least the largest companies to set, and what we will hope will be also an obligation to implement transition plans, including climate targets. Otherwise, what's the point, right, of having the target and transition plan and then not implement it? And finally, the verification is also quite important, which again, at least looking at the CSRD and ESRSs, it's already in there, right? In a sense, I mean, to ensure there is limited assurance provided actually on the information, so that's already great. But yeah, maybe just a kind of a message also to the companies that are not going to be necessarily captured by Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that once again, this is quite of large importance actually to the investors to ensure that the data is reliable. So just to sum up, science-based, reliable, and comparable. And maybe just one last bit is that, I think the targets, of course, have to be kind of divided into the actions, short-term, medium, long-term, so that obviously, then it helps to better understand how companies are doing with the implementation.
Thank you. So Alexandra, you mentioned maybe the lack of information at sectoral level, what is really for a sector, the level of ambition that would be expected on climate targets. SBTi is currently working on sectoral guidance for the chemical sector. How do you see it as a useful and complementary source of information? And I would also like to hear the Commission's view on this point, if possible.
Maybe just first one clarification. I think maybe lack of information for the sectorial disclosures, that would be a little bit going too far, in a sense that I think even the first set of the European sustainability reporting standards already provides quite a bit of actually information on how and what to disclose. I would say by companies from all sectors. That's why they're sector agnostic standards. So with regards to that, I would anyway primarily guide, I would say, companies in towards this direction. But it is true that SBTi has been quite well perceived by the investors, I would say, from within and outside the EU. So of course, especially if now they are developing actually more sectorial disclosures, or guidance, in terms of how to design transition plans. It could also be seen as some kind of a complementary information to that end, or also something to look into before the respective sectorial European sustainability reporting standards are developed.
Thank you. Sven?
But not much to add. Indeed, our idea is that this first set of standards that we have adopted now, I think, is pretty comprehensive already and covers a lot of things, and also gives a lot of room for each sector to report on its specific activities. But then from our side, we're planning, of course, to adopt sector-specific standards. We've now just proposed to delay this a bit because we also think this will help with the reporting burden. So the idea now is to start in 2026 with adopting a first batch of sector-specific standards, not all of them at the same time, but step by step. And in the interim period, of course, I think companies are welcome, and it's also recognized in the ESRS to use other kinds of frameworks to help guide their reporting, to give a full picture, if you want.
Thank you. To conclude, I would like to turn with both of you with the question of today's conversation. Could you please give a short final statement on whether and to what degree are transition plans already licensed to operate for companies? Sven, do you want to start?
Well, as I said in the beginning, but what we did in the financial sphere on sustainable finances, we increased the requirements on transparency, on providing information into the marketplace, and I think transition plans are an important element of that. We haven't introduced a license requirement, and we're not planning to do that, I think. But I think it's more a question of how the market will deal with this and how the market will make use of it. And I'm sure that transition plans will become more and more important, as you said. And I'm sure that investors will want to see them. And I think they will play an important role in allowing a company to explain to the outside world how exactly they want to get to the goals that they set themselves. So yes, it is a very important element. But again, from our perspective, what we've always done on sustainable finances, we want to set the framework within which companies report in a reliable, comparable way. And then I think it's for the market in the end to make up its mind and take the right decisions.
Mm-hmm. Alexandra?
Well, I think certainly it's something that is really important and can be definitely helpful in attracting financing. Basically, I think it's also important that companies think about it not only from the perspective of, regulatory requirements or even merely attracting finance. I think it's really something important for companies basically also to be more aware of the transition and physical risks they might be facing in the medium to long term, and basically ensuring their businesses are prepared for that and that they develop strategies to better deal with climate change, right? And I think, I might sound now like a kind of activist, but the bottom line is there is no planet B, okay? And I think companies, in order to make money, also need the environment, right? In a good kind of shape. So I think basically my message to the companies would be like, don't do it only because it's a regulatory requirement. Don't do it only, to attract better financing, even though, of course, that's a very important point. Well, do it actually for yourselves and for, our collective future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. So it is clear, transition plans are becoming increasingly demanded and referenced by regulators, investors, and by our own downstream consumers. It is also clear, transition plans will soon become a concrete legal obligation. They ensure that the business model and strategy of a company are compatible with the Green Deal objective, transforming pledges into concrete actions. Thank you for joining us, Alexandra and Sven. And to everyone at home, please continue to engage in the chat. We will be following up and answering your questions.